Gospel Podcast with your host, Matthew and Ritah Murphy.
Welcome. We've been covering interpretive authority over the last couple of episodes. We're going to close it out here in episode 7. Interpretive authority is by far the longest chapter in the Fifth Gospel Project. Throughout this series, we've also been reframing what we mean by divine inspiration, not simply as God handing the early Christians a finished text, but as the movement, the breath in the ancient sense of the Spirit. As we discussed in episode 3, that Spirit moves us toward a life centered on agape, genuinely desiring and helping others experience the same peace, the same wholeness, and the same well-being that we desire for ourselves. Human interpretation is flawed. It is susceptible to bias, expectation, memory, and cultural pressure. And if we're going to acknowledge potential flaws when interpreting the Bible today, we have to be willing to apply that same principle to the biblical writers themselves. They weren't stenographers recording Jesus's word-for-word statements with perfect understanding. They were humans like us, witnesses and theologians, interpreters working from a stable core of remembered events and teachings, and trying to communicate what they believed those events meant. That's not a fabrication or a deliberate intent to deceive. I see stronger evidence, some of it we covered in the last episode, that this was pure interpretation, an honest effort from these communities to convey the truth of what they heard and witnessed. And like all human interpretation, it could reflect assumptions and expectations that in some scenarios weren't necessarily identical to Jesus's own intent.
Hello, everyone. Can you give us a concrete example of where the gospel writers' expectations may have influenced how they understood or presented what Jesus said?
Uh, yeah. I think Jewish apocalyptic expectation is a good example. The synoptic gospels preserve Jesus speaking about coming judgment, the destruction of the temple, and the coming of the Son of Man, to borrow from some of the Daniel, perhaps even First Enoch imagery. Some of the earliest Christians appear to have understood at least some of this language through the expectation that Jesus would return within their generation. These kinds of prophetic expectations weren't unique to Christianity. The Josephus tells us in his late first century book, The Jewish War, about Jesus ben Ananias, who years before the destruction of Jerusalem went through the city proclaiming judgment against Jerusalem and the temple. So predictions of coming catastrophe existed before 70 CE, and as with Jesus of Nazareth's own warnings, were open to more than one interpretation. In the book, I explore what this historical environment may tell us about the development and the dating of the gospel traditions. But the larger point here is that the gospel writers were interpreting Jesus within a world already filled with diverse apocalyptic expectations. And because people have a history of interpreting things imperfectly, including apocalyptic revelations like these, we shouldn't treat every part of the tradition as equally certain or equally reliable. Some claims are simply better supported than others.
Okay. But if we're not treating every part of the tradition as equally reliable, how do we weigh or decide which which claims deserve the most confidence?
Mm, yeah, good question. And we talked about some of this in episode 4, I believe. But when it comes to human witness and testimony, our confidence should scale with the evidence. The highest for the resurrection itself, the lowest for, or when I say highest confidence, it would be in some of the common core themes, such as the Sermon on the Mount or the commandment to love, or as I mentioned, the resurrection. Our lowest confidence would be in some of those conditions, such as where the post resurrection appearances happen, or the birth narrative, or where the ascension took place. All four gospels and the New Testament more broadly affirm the same core conviction that Jesus was raised from the dead. That claim is early and evidenced by some of the Pauline creeds that go back within a decade of Jesus's crucifixion. And it's also attested independently of any single gospel's narrative details. But when we move into the specifics of the post resurrection appearances and the ascension, the accounts don't line up as neatly. Matthew centers the disciples' post resurrection encounter with Jesus in Galilee, while Luke keeps the post resurrection story centered around Jerusalem and has the disciples remain there. John includes appearances in both Jerusalem and Galilee, kind of a merger, while Mark's earliest surviving ending stops before any appearance of the risen Jesus is actually narrated. Even the final geographical setting differs. Matthew ends with Jesus on a mountain in Galilee without narrating an actual ascension, while Luke places the ascension near Bethany outside Jerusalem. Acts, which was written by the same author as Luke, seems to have a slightly different location, even though they can be interpreted as around the same area.
But as someone who trusts these texts, I still have to ask, don't those differences threaten the credibility of the gospel accounts? And why should I see them as an interpretation rather than evidence the writers just got it wrong?
Right, right. Well, what we've been explaining is some of these divergences, especially in the post resurrection accounts, just look like ordinary interpretation at work. It's different writers and communities holding the same core proclamation while explaining and situating it through their own perspectives, questions, and circumstances. It's the same pattern courts in the modern times see every day. Several reliable witnesses to the same car accident will agree on what fundamentally happened, but differ on the details, such as the exact timing of the event, or who spoke first, or which direction a vehicle swerved. Not because any of them are lying, but because each was watching from a different vantage point with different assumptions about what mattered. We find these patterns in the Gospels. They reflect the pattern of how people carry shared experiences. The core can remain solid and stable, even as details and meaning are worked out differently by those who hold it. And this same pattern helps us frame divine inspiration. The source can be perfect without every human expression of it being perfect. The Spirit is like a perfect song played through the instruments of amateur musicians. We miss notes, we drift out of tune, we bring our own style to it, habits, our own assumptions, our own flaws, the way anyone does with the song they hear but haven't quite mastered. Think of a casual musician playing your favorite song or somebody singing it at a karaoke spot. The performance may be imperfect, but you still vibe to the song. And that's because underneath all of it, one melody keeps breaking through. You can hear and recognize it even in the mistakes. This is how we understand the fifth gospel, a self-giving purpose, the movement away from self and toward the good of another. It's the perfect song, the perfect core, the perfect melody, no matter how off-key and imperfect we play it. The musicians are imperfect, but the song itself is timeless.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Our lives need to reflect agape or universal love more and more. To use your analogy, agape is a perfect melody. It was played perfectly by Jesus.
Amen. Yep. So that's it. So keep questioning, keep exploring, keep believing. Thanks again for joining us. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll connect again next time.